Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today, we have a very interesting guest on maybe the most important topic facing America, probably at least through June or July, and that is Michael R. Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. Most recently, he's the author of The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. So, Michael, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you very much for joining us. And we want to just kind of set the table here. And we know that the circumstances that caused the 2008 financial crisis were quite different from the economic disruption that we faced during the pandemic. But in the instances of both of these crises or economic disruption, the government did intervene. This time around, the rescue package was significantly larger. Is it even possible to compare and contrast the government stimulus and spending from the '08 crisis to today?
Well, you can certainly compare them, and they were very, very different. The '08 economic stimulus effort totaled in the neighborhood of $800 billion, and the total effort to combat the economic effects of the pandemic came close to $6 trillion. So very, very different in size, very different in magnitude. In addition, there's kind of a question of what's the right size, and I think that question, there's a lot of confusion around that question. One way to think about it is, what's the economy's underlying potential to produce goods and services? If everybody who wanted a job had a job, if everybody who had a job was working as many hours as they wanted to work, if every factory in America was running at full capacity, if businesses and workers were using technology to its fullest extent to make them as productive as possible, how much stuff can we produce? How many goods and services can we produce? What's the dollar value of total goods and services we could produce? What would GDP be under those circumstances? And what happens in an economic downturn is that not everybody who wants a job gets a job. Not everybody who has a job works as many hours as they want to work. Businesses don't run their factories at full capacity because they worry that the demand for their products and the demand for their services won't be there. And so you can think of economic stimulus as kind of a way to support the economy when private demand drops. And what happened during the '08 crisis was that Congress responded, but arguably Congress didn't respond enough. The pace of the recovery from the 2008 crisis would have been slower if Congress hadn't passed the Recovery Act. But the Recovery Act probably wasn't big enough. And as importantly, the Recovery Act was very poorly designed. And so a lot of the spending in the Recovery Act took months and months and months, if not longer, to actually get into the economy. We had the opposite problem with the response to the pandemic. The response, the economic policy response, the fiscal policy response, what Congress did to respond to the pandemic was really much, much, much too big. And you can kind of think of the economy as a bathtub, and when the bathtub is filled to the brim, that's the economy operating at potential. That's the economy producing as much stuff, as many goods and services as it can, given its underlying resources. In a recession, the water goes 3/4 of the way up the bathtub, or 90% of the way up the bathtub, but not all the way to the top. The Recovery Act, because of its design and because of its size, failed to get the water to the top of the bathtub after the '08 crisis. After the pandemic, Congress didn't turn off the tap. And so we filled the bathtub, and then we kept the tap running, and there's water spilling all over the floor. And now, like, the bathroom is flooded. And all that water on the floor and all that flooding shows up as the inflation that we've been living with for roughly a year and a half. That's what happens when Congress juices economic demand well above the ability of the supply side of the economy to meet that demand. You end up with these large price increases because businesses just can't produce anymore, and so they raise prices instead. And the size of the stimulus isn't the only reason we've had inflation, certainly, but it's been a big part of it. And so that's, in addition to just comparing the size of the response to both crises, I think it's useful to kind of think about them relative to the economy's supply side and the economy's ability to meet the demand that those laws juiced.
So, Michael, what you just mentioned is one of the things that we wanted to investigate with you and to get your perspective on, because it seems like everyone does agree with you that the excess spending that happened during the pandemic was a contributor to inflation.
Finally, though.
Oh, yeah, perhaps it took a while. Yeah.
It took a while. There's a lot of debate about that. Those of us who were arguing that the American Rescue Plan was too large, that argument being made in primarily in February and March of 2021, there were not a lot of us. So, but yes, I think at this point there's a much broader agreement on that point.
I suppose the doubters have been pointing to these other factors that you refer to, the global supply chain crisis, particularly in regards to the war in Ukraine and the shutdown of factories in China. And those that were the strongest defenders of the U.S. government COVID response wanted to point to these as the biggest factors behind inflation, and perhaps the American Rescue Plan is a smaller factor. In your estimation, what is the correct way to understand this balance of factors? How important is the American fiscal policy? Is it 20% of the inflation? Is it 80% of the inflation? Maybe you can't give us a number, but give us an idea of how big of a factor it is in regard to this balance with the other factors.
I think it really depends on kind of what time period you're looking at. And so if you look at 2021, before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, launching that brutal war in Ukraine, we had a lot of inflation. And if you kind of look at inflation in 2021, I would argue that the American Rescue Plan was responsible for, a little more than half of the excess inflation that we had. So we always want some inflation, right? The Fed doesn't want there to be no inflation. The Fed wants consumer prices to grow at a 2% annual rate. So the Fed's targeting 2% inflation, which is higher than zero. And so if you look at the excess inflation, the inflation over and above 2% that we had in 2021, I think a little more than half of that came from the American Rescue Plan, and the rest of it came from other supply-related factors, and there were a lot of supply-related factors even before the war in Ukraine. Of course, then the war in Ukraine really exacerbated supply problems in the economy. The war in Ukraine led to substantial increases in the price of energy, substantial increases in the price of other commodities, including agricultural commodities, and so that showed up in higher food prices. Then, China, had its zero COVID policy, and that led to additional supply problems. And so supply was a bigger story in 2022 than it was in 2021. But demand issues that were fueled not only by the American Rescue Plan, people forget. One of the reasons the American Rescue Plan was, in my view, so inadvisable is because in December of 2020, after the presidential election, Congress passed and President Trump signed a $900 billion stimulus. Remember, the Recovery Act following the 2008 crisis was about $800 billion. And so here we are in December of 2020, Congress signs a $900 billion stimulus. I'm sorry, the president signs a $900 billion stimulus. And then, a couple of months later, we add another $1.9 trillion on top of that. 2022, certainly supply factors were a big part of the story, but demand factors were a big part of the story too, driven by the American Rescue Plan, but also by other efforts to support the economy during the pandemic that were signed into law by President Trump.
If you've been shaking your head at the grocery store checkout or endured the pain at the pump, you felt the impact of inflation.
Inflation is simply the price that we pay for similar goods over a period of time.
That increase has now reached its highest level in 4 decades. Economists tell News 9 there are 2 major factors driving inflation. One was the government response to the COVID-19 pandemic in the form of monetary policy and relief funds to help sustain the economy.
To the tune of $2 trillion. That increased the supply of money. And at the same time, we had the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, increased the liquidity in the system, the amount of cash in the system, and brought the interest rate to almost zero.
Those lower rates pumped billions more dollars into the economy. Then economists say the second factor, also related to the pandemic, kicked in. Global supply chains became snarled and delayed, meaning that in America, a nation of consumers, supply is not meeting demand.
So, Michael, we're contrasting these 2 different scenarios and the 2 different outcomes that came from 2 different policy responses. So, in one case, after 2008, we had a much slower recovery with high unemployment but no inflation. In this case, we've got almost full employment, very little unemployment, but high inflation. I know that both of these scenarios have their own share of challenges and downsides, but as an economic manager in your country, which of these situations would you rather be facing?
Well, I would like a third option, which is to have fiscal policy that is able to foster a really rapid and robust labor market recovery, but that doesn't give us 9% consumer price inflation like we've had. And the reason why is because my concern is that the kind of question that you asked, which is a very good and reasonable question, might present a kind of a false dichotomy. I think the challenge is that yes, going overboard, not turning the bathtub spigot off, allowing water to kind of overflow the bathtub and slosh onto the floor, that does get people back to work quickly, for sure, no doubt about it. Right now, there are 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed worker. Businesses just can't find the workers they need, and the reason that they want workers so badly is because demand for their products and services is still off the charts. And the reason demand for their products and services are still off the charts is because consumers have a lot of money in their pockets. That's great, and there have been other beneficial effects of it as well. Wages are growing fastest for low-wage workers. Wages at the bottom of the wage distribution are growing, 2-3 times as fast as wages at the top. And that's because the businesses that are the most desperate to hire are businesses that employ a relatively larger share of workers who earn lower wages. But for most workers, the purchasing power of their wages after taking into account inflation are dropping at the fastest pace in 40 years. Most households are seeing their inflation-adjusted incomes go down, not up. And so, yes, like we have this fantastic labor market recovery, and that's great. And people have jobs, which is really important. But the benefits from those jobs are not what they should be because of the inflation. Secondly, what you want is a sustained recovery. What we had following the 2008 financial crisis was a recovery that lasted until the pandemic, and that produced that kind of sustained recovery where inflation stayed at or below the Fed's target. My concern is that by juicing demand, well above the supply side of the economy's ability to handle that demand, that we're going to end up with a recession. And so we're going to have had, this really rapid recovery that took the unemployment rate down into the 3s and that put everybody back to work, but that that's going to be followed by a recession where the unemployment rate goes up. And we don't know what that recession is going to look like. We don't know what that recovery is going to look like. And so it's hard to really know kind of which regime is better. But I think it's easy to know the best regime is one where fiscal and monetary policy certainly respond to macroeconomic conditions, but do so in a way that is closely tethered to the actual macroeconomic needs. That way, you don't get a situation where there are years where there are 2, 3, 4, 5 unemployed workers for every job opening because demand doesn't come back, and you don't get a situation where you have 9% inflation.
Yeah, good morning, Andrew. I can't think of another major vote on a major piece of legislation that was this unanimous, 96-0. And the vote, Andrew, would have been even more if it hadn't been for the fact that so many members of Congress are sequestered back at home or are suffering themselves from this virus. So we could have seen a 100-0 vote potentially yesterday in the United States Senate, but that's where it landed at 96-0. What's in the bill? Well, there's a little something for just about everybody in the economy here. Let's whip through some of the details here for you. For almost everybody, there are these direct payments of up to $1,200 per person. That's $500 per child. That phases out at about $75,000 of income gradually, and over $100,000 of income, you won't get anything.
I wanted to get in one last aspect of this most recent stimulus, which was different from 2008. I'm sure there are plenty of other examples, but specifically, it felt like there was almost a paradigm shift. And now we have direct payments to people and significant amounts of direct payments to people. So could you get into how now we have maybe a year or 2 years from when those payments were originally made? Were they effective? And do we envision these type of economic stimulus plans to be an arrow in our quiver moving forward to deal with economic crises?
So we had direct stimulus payments before. They were just a lot smaller. President Bush had them, for example. And, we didn't kind of keep doing them like we did in the pandemic. I think it's a great question, and I do think that one of the big things that economists and policy analysts are thinking about is exactly that question. Should we be relying more on those sorts of just direct payments? And I think that is definitely going to feature in debates about how to respond to the next recession. I think depending on the kind of composition of Congress and who's sitting in the White House, that's something that we could see used much more aggressively in the next recession or in a future recession than we have typically seen. My hope is that those payments are done in a more targeted way. There's very little reason to be giving checks to people who make $200,000 a year, $300,000 a year, things of that, magnitudes like that, particularly in a situation where like those people haven't lost jobs or, nothing bad has happened to them. And, even worse, in a situation where because of monetary policy, the value of their home is up 20% and, their stock portfolio is up 20% and that sort of thing. And so, I think that the direct checks to households who, what should we be doing in a recession? We should be helping people who are truly in need. We should be helping people whose lives are upended, who really experience a crisis. Programs like food stamps, programs like unemployment insurance serve that role. It's possible that we should be adding direct checks to households who find themselves in real need. But it's very difficult for me to imagine a scenario where I would find myself supporting checks the way that checks were done with the American Rescue Plan, where they were going to people who really were very high income people.
I think the analogy that was used on a lot of cable news networks that just sticks with me is the government set up a sprinkler system where they were just raining cash everywhere.
Yeah. So you want to, if you don't have unlimited water, you want to water the lawn where where the grass needs the water the most. And we don't have unlimited water.
Hello, I'm Andrew Yang, and I'm running for president as a Democrat in 2020. I'm not a politician, I'm a problem solver. I spent the last number of years helping to create thousands of American jobs in the Midwest and the South. And I'm running for president to help solve the problems that got Donald Trump elected in 2016. Namely that we'd automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs. And what we did to the manufacturing jobs, we're about to do to the retail jobs, the call center jobs, the fast food jobs, the truck driving jobs, and on through the economy. And I'm running for president to help America transition through this time. My flagship proposal is the freedom dividend of $1,000 a month for every American adult starting at age 18. This would create millions of jobs, make our children and families stronger, and give all Americans a better chance to transition in the economy of the 21st century. It's not left, it's not right, it's forward.
So, Michael, given the perspective that you've just shared with us about these 1-2-time payments, about how they should have been more means tested or targeted, I think I'm probably safe in assuming that you don't think highly of the concept of universal basic income, which was becoming rather popular ahead of the pandemic. And some people believe anticipated the policy response or inspired the policy response during the pandemic. I'd like to, just since we're on the topic of direct payments, see if I can get a more comprehensive idea of your thoughts on that particular concept.
Sure. So, I think it's one of those terms that means a lot of different things to different people. But if you kind of take the common, or at least the original use of the term, universal basic income, what does universal mean? It means it goes to everybody, regardless of circumstances. What does basic mean? It means that it's enough to ensure a basic standard of living. And so a common proposal is $10,000 per year per person, and then of course income means it's a check. I think that would probably be a civilization destroying disaster. I think that if it didn't destroy civilization, that would only be because it would be like completely impossible to implement. Why would it be impossible to implement? I mean, we don't have that kind of money. The kind of libertarians who support that proposal have in mind that we completely eliminate the entire social safety net. So no more food stamps, no more housing assistance, no more disability insurance, no more X, Y, and Z. Even if we were to do that, we still don't have enough money for a lot of these proposals. The progressives who want to do it, they want to keep all the other stuff and just add that on. And we definitely don't have enough money to do that. If we were to do what the libertarians want to do, I just don't think it's politically sustainable. And in this case, I think the reason it's not politically sustainable is because it's just fundamentally deeply unjust. Imagine two people who live side by side in houses right next to each other. One person is a perfectly healthy 35-year-old guy, has a wife and 2 kids, and good education and great earnings potential. He's getting a check for $40,000. The person next door is a veteran, and the veteran had his legs blown off by a bomb fighting in a war for America, and the veteran has severe psychological problems as a consequence of the war, and the guy can't work. He's getting $10,000. That just doesn't seem just to me. Libertarians who support this, one of the features in their mind of this program would be that people would be responsible for their choices. They argue, not unreasonably, that receiving government benefits is an indignity, and that you are a recipient, and that people know you receive the benefits, and that's and a lot of times those benefits can be prescriptive. So you can have this credit card, but you can only spend it on food. And by the way, you can't buy Coca-Cola, or you can buy 1 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola per month, but not 2, and or whatever. It's very prescriptive, and it's very paternalistic. It's argued that a benefit would be you don't have to do that anymore. Well, what happens if you blow all your money on gambling and alcohol? Well, a libertarian says that's your choice and it's nobody else's business what you do. But what if you have kids and now your kids don't have any food because you spent all your money on alcohol and on gambling? That's a problem. And I think a libertarian answer might be, well, they're your kids, and if you want your kids to not have any food, that's up to you. That's not a very compelling or satisfying answer to that problem. And it really kind of highlights a question: what is the safety net for? Is that money for the kids? Is that money for the adult? If the money's for the kids, then the entire, or even in part, if the money's for the kids, then the entire rationale for universal basic income, really gets called into question. Finally, I know I know you probably don't want me to talk about this for 20 minutes or so, but you didn't realize you were pushing a button here. I know, but I'm very concerned about the effects that a really generous universal basic income would have on employment. I think employment is, having people work is extremely important for the economy. It unlocks creative potential. It unlocks an ecosystem that fosters dynamism and innovation, the kinds of innovations that really propel increases in the quality of life that people have. And it's really good for society. It's good for society that people are occupied. It's good for that their time is occupied. It's good for society that people, what would you be doing with your time if you weren't working? Probably, a lot of people wouldn't be doing good things. And work helps them to not do those ungood things. It's good for society to have people making contributions. It's also, I think, deeply important for individuals. It's deeply important for dignity. It's deeply important, I think, for people's ability to lead a flourishing life. And I worry about the effects that UBI would have on that. So yes, not a fan.
Michael, the way that you describe the libertarian concept of UBI reminded me a little bit of this idea of the 30% national sales tax, where you're just eliminating any kind of preference for people's means and needs. And instead, the idea that everyone gets the same amount or everyone pays the same amount to buy a product. Oh, that's fair on paper. But when you're completely agnostic to the means that people actually have to afford a proper lifestyle, you're ignoring the completely asymmetric way that policy would play out on household to household basis.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of taxing consumption much more than we do and taxing income much less than we do, but you can do that in a progressive way so that people who have higher incomes pay greater taxes.
Where do we go from here? What happens? And why does the government get to keep spending? As Americans, we have credit cards, we have limits. You can't spend once you hit your limit.
Well, we see the numbers already, $31 trillion in debt, and then we pass this $1.7 trillion monstrosity, plus the $1.5 trillion in COVID spending. At some point, enough is enough. And the Democrats' response to this was what? 87,000 IRS agents. And I'm here to tell you that we don't have a tax revenue problem. It's clear that we have a spending problem. I can tell you one thing, here in Houston's Congressional District 38 that I represent, my answer is a hard no on raising the debt ceiling. I have a 3-week-old boy at my house, I have a 4-year-old daughter, and a 2-year-old daughter. And I'm here to tell you that I am not going to pass this on to them. And at some point, we have to take a look at this and say, spending has got to stop. We have got to get our house in order. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Ainsley. We as Americans actually have to balance our budget every single year, and they expect that from our government as well.
So, Michael, this question, and this is accurate. I've been wanting to know an answer for this for 9 years, maybe 10 years, and we're going to switch to the debt. But before we get to the debt limit, I was wondering if you could just help us understand why limiting our national debt is important. The GOP lawmakers, like the gentleman I used to work for, he was a House Freedom Caucus member. So he was advocating for, in a lot of ways, cutting the social safety net because the debt that we had under President Obama represented this existential crisis. Is this something that we actually need to be mindful of and we need to be aware of and we need to work towards legislative solutions? Because when the GOP actually gets in power, they don't do anything with it. Actually, no, that's a lie. They just make it more out of control. Or is this just political messaging by one party to attack the other party when that party is in power?
Yeah, so I think both parties are sincere in their concern about the deficit and the national debt, but I also think both parties have other priorities that they prioritize above adding to the deficit. And so, Republicans, I think, really do care about debt and deficits. They just care more about cutting taxes. And I think Democrats do care about debt and deficits. They just care more about increasing spending. And that's a lot of the kind of dynamic that we're in. The debt matters. I think that gets lost in this debate for precisely the reasons you say, because Republicans shut down the government over the debt and take the government to the brink of default in 2011 over the debt, and then they win the White House, and all of a sudden they rack up tons of debt. What happened there, guys? The Democrats, when attempting to defeat the 2017 tax law, started arguing about how important it is that we not add to the debt. And then people are like, well, wait a minute, guys, didn't you just, spend all this money and, et cetera, et cetera. Just because it's neither party's top priority doesn't mean that it doesn't really matter a lot for the economy, and that it doesn't matter for individual people's economic outcomes. To kind of tie this to our earlier conversation, let me just be clear that there are definitely times where you want to run a deficit. There are definitely times where you want to incur debt. Congress was 100% right to pass a massive fiscal support measure in March of 2020 without paying for it. That was absolutely the right thing to do. Congress was right during World War II to run up big deficits. And so you want the government to have the ability to run deficits, to issue debt. Things like, requirements that the budget be in balance every year would be deeply harmful during catastrophes or wars or crises or situations of that nature. But over the longer term, we have a big problem, and the problem is that federal spending is projected to grow much faster than federal revenue, and that will lead us with a situation where the size of the national debt just grows and grows and grows and grows. Why does that matter? That matters because it crowds out private investment. You have all this debt that pushes up interest rates, that makes it more expensive for businesses, for private sector businesses, to borrow money to invest. If private sector businesses are investing a little bit less, that means that workers are a little bit less productive. If workers are a little bit less productive, that means their wages are a little bit lower. If their wages are a little bit lower, that means their incomes are a little bit lower and their living standards are growing a little bit faster. And if that's a problem over a 20, 30, or 40-year time horizon, then small little changes in any given year add up to a lot. And over a 30-year period, we're in a very different place. Household incomes are much lower, wages are much lower, productivity growth is much slower than it would have been if we had had a responsible, sustainable trajectory for the debt. It matters because it makes it more expensive for people to buy houses and buy cars. It matters because a lot of that debt is held by foreign entities. You talk to military experts, and they'll tell you that the national debt is a significant national security risk. A recent chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff singled it out as one of the most important security risks that face the United States. The debt also matters because it crowds out other spending that could be happening. That means less money for infrastructure, less money for basic research, less money for law enforcement, less money for programs that foster upward economic mobility. Those are just budget projections, but the political reality is that when we start spending, as the debt grows and grows, the interest payments that taxpayers have to pay grow and grow, and when we reach a point where we're spending more money servicing the debt, where debt interest payments are greater than the amount we spend on the military, think about how hard it's going to be to get a really good job training program through Congress. Think about how hard it's going to be to get a really good infrastructure bill through Congress. Think about how hard it's going to be to, fund scientific research that can unlock innovations that really lead to big improvements in standard of living and quality of life. So, the debt matters economically. The debt matters in terms of our security. The debt matters because the bigger the debt is, the harder it is for our government to make the kinds of investments in other areas of public policy that are so critical to make.
So I want to put a really fine point on this because clearly you've outlined that the debt is very important and you've created a very scary scenario that I'm picturing in my mind 20, 30 years from now. But these numbers that we're talking about are really big. I think we're 31 trillion in debt. And the members of Congress from the right, the GOP, have been basically the boy that has cried wolf from my perspective, right? It's been messaging on the debt, and the way they've been messaging on the debt, a lot of these members, I'm not saying all of them, has been that if we don't fix this, it's going to be a problem basically tomorrow. Some of them are saying, some of the more extreme members. So when we're, not economists, but we do follow the news and politics and everything else, is there a red line that we could cross with the national debt that would signal the tipping point that you'd kind of outlined in the worst case scenario? Is it something like debt to GDP? Is it something like debt to the revenue we're intaking? And I'm sure it's nuanced and there's gray, but is there anything that we can look at to understand when we're approaching this really, really dire set of circumstances that you're outlining?
I think the right way to think about the debt, say there are two kinds of problems. There are the kinds of problems where a bear shows up at your door. That's an immediate crisis. You need to get out of your house or get a gun or do something, or you're going to die like at that moment. And then the other type of problem is termites in the woodwork of your house. And that is not an immediate problem. If you don't take care of that today, that's not a big deal. If you wait until tomorrow or you wait until next week, that's basically the same as taking care of it today. But if you don't take care of it, then one day your house is going to collapse. And if that happens while you're in it, you're going to be just as dead as if that bear ate you. And the debt is the best way to think about the debt between those two is that it's a termites in the woodwork problem. The risk is that kind of over time, gradually, we have less private investment, and that leads to a less productive workforce that earns lower wages, has lower incomes. That over time, we don't pass laws to improve our infrastructure. We don't pass laws to fund innovation. We don't pass laws to advance upward mobility, and that we just end up with a kind of more sclerotic, less mobile, less dynamic economy where people who are born into poverty or lower income households just have much less of a chance to rise. I think that those risks are very likely to materialize if Congress doesn't do something. There is, I think, also a bear at the door type risk here. And, the bear at the door type risk is hard to forecast. But right now, the U.S. is really, I think, banking on the fact that there's nowhere else to go. U.S. Treasury bonds are the bedrock of the global financial system. We can run up debt and run up debt and run up debt. And bond investors may not like that in theory, but what are they going to do? They're not going to redesign the global financial system so that the euro is the bedrock, or so that China's debt is the bedrock, or something of that nature. But will that be true 30 years from now? 30 years from now is a long time. It really may be that something happens in kind of global affairs that exposes the United States to the kinds of risks that another nation that doesn't have the U.S.'s preeminence in the world would experience if it had a debt that was as large as ours will be, 15, 20 years from now. I don't think we want that to happen. That just seems like a kind of wildly imprudent situation to put the U.S. in. It's not a problem that needs to be fully solved in the next 6 months. It does not, in my view, make sense to attempt to balance the budget in the next 10 years. But right now we have a problem, which is that the level of the debt relative to the size of the economy keeps going up and up and up and up and up. We need it to go down. Doesn't need to go to zero, but it just needs to go down. That needs to be a top priority.
Defaulting on the national debt should be regarded as unthinkable. Failing to increase the debt limit would have absolutely catastrophic economic consequences. It would be utterly unprecedented in American history for the United States government to default on its legal obligations. I believe it would precipitate a financial crisis. It would threaten the jobs and savings of Americans, and at a time when we're still recovering from the COVID pandemic. I would plead with Congress simply to protect the full faith and credit of the United States by acting to raise or suspend the debt limit as soon as possible.
What actually happens if the United States does not raise the debt ceiling and defaults? What does that actually mean?
I think the following is the worst case scenario. The United States doesn't raise the debt ceiling. The Treasury Department cannot issue new debt. The Treasury Department cannot borrow. A payment needs to be made. The Treasury can't make the payment in full because there's not enough tax revenue, and the Treasury can't borrow. The Dow drops by thousands of points. There's complete chaos in financial markets. Markets freeze up. People want to hoard cash. There are massive liquidity problems. A global financial crisis begins. The Fed steps in and attempts to do what it can, but what it can do is limited. The discussion around the globe is that political dysfunction in Washington has made it such that the U.S. is no longer a nation that honors its laws, and that the U.S. is no longer a nation that honors its financial obligations. And that continues for one day, maybe 2 days, and then a bill to increase the debt ceiling with no other conditions, a clean debt ceiling increase, passes both houses of Congress with substantial bipartisan support. That I think is what happens. I think that is the worst case scenario that we're looking at. And so that's a really bad scenario. That's a scenario that finds consumer confidence about the economy plummeting, which itself is a drag on consumer spending and economic growth. That is a scenario where interest payments, where interest rates on debt that is maturing near that time period skyrocket, leaving taxpayers on the hook for billions of extra dollars. That's a situation where the U.S.'s credit rating is downgraded. It's a situation where U.S. borrowing costs are higher over a period of years, if not decades, which means that the cost of private sector investment goes up, which means that productivity, wages, and incomes go down, which means that your credit card interest rate is higher, which means that it's harder for you to get a car loan or harder for you to get a loan for a house. And it means that the United States has chosen to be a nation that doesn't honor its obligations. And America's self-conception is substantially damaged. America's standing in the world is substantially damaged.
That last part really resonates because I think that the long lasting damage that could be done is just something that's hard for us to comprehend, especially considering the trajectory we are on with our allies, right? We're now back being a global leader with Ukraine and even settling some trade disputes over in Europe. So it just seems unthinkable, unimaginable to me that folks would be playing with matches next to the gasoline pump, right? And in that vein, Michael, we do have the Republicans in the House. It seems like Senator McConnell's like, McCarthy, you need to figure this out and go at it. Do you have a clear picture of what the Republicans in the House are actually gearing up to fight over the debt limit about? Do they have clear asks, or is this still opaque and kind of developing?
I certainly don't have a clear picture. I don't think they have a clear picture from my conversations with them. They don't have a clear picture. Some say they want to cut spending on Medicare and Social Security. Others explicitly don't want to do that. And President Trump weighed in recently and said he didn't think that's a good idea either. And that's going to carry some weight with members. I think some are, really insisting that some spending be cut. I think others would be willing to make a trade around something other than spending. And so there's a kind of a divergence of views over that. Candidly, I think some others, just want to rattle the cage a little bit and don't have a clear policy objective here. They have a kind of a political objective. And then I think that there are a lot of members, and this is not a criticism of those members, because this is an issue that hadn't come up a lot. But I think there are a lot of members who I think are learning about the stakes here, and they're trying to wrap their heads around this, and they're learning more about it. But they didn't walk into this situation with a mastery of the situation, and they're trying to acquire one. But let me say, Republicans are right that we have a debt problem, have a deficit problem, that we need to reduce spending. That is all right. But I think that reducing that spending needs to be done in a responsible way. And I think that if Republicans are going to use the debt ceiling as leverage to get something done, that something needs to get done in March or April, before you start to see really substantial concern register about default risk in financial markets, and before you start to see substantial volatility in financial markets.
Is there any type of response we can see from the markets, from financial leaders on Wall Street, from the titans of industry that forces Republicans to work on raising the debt limit? Is there some type of catalyst that the financial markets can provide without ruining and destroying the United States reputation on the global stage? Or is this really something that cooler heads need to prevail on Capitol Hill on their own?
I think cooler heads need to prevail. I think you're already starting to see some indications in markets of the debt ceiling affecting behavior, and that's showing up in yields and prices and credit default swaps and things of that nature. But I think the closer we get to when Treasury runs out of money, the greater the turmoil is going to be. If this comes down to the 11th hour and the debt ceiling is raised at the very last minute, that's going to that's going to lead to substantial problems. In 2011, we didn't default. A deal was struck at the 11th hour, and the S&P 500 lost 15% of its value. The 15%, U.S. credit rating was downgraded, and taxpayers were on the hook for billions and billions of dollars in extra interest payments because of higher borrowing costs. And so, getting out of the wire, even if you don't default, even if you raise the debt ceiling, if you wait until the 11th hour to do it, that still causes lots and lots of damage to both stock prices and to interest payments that taxpayers have to pay. And so we're moving toward that. And Congress needs to understand that. And they need to take advantage of the month of January, the month of February, and the month of March in order to get a plan together and strike a deal with the president before you start to see really substantial turmoil. Because once you start seeing that kind of turmoil, and once you start seeing the situation affect stock prices and affect bond yields and things of that nature, then you just need to raise the debt ceiling. And so if Republicans hope to extract a concession, they need to extract that concession soon, because at some point very soon, it just becomes irresponsible to attempt to extract a concession. It's a cooler heads prevail kind of situation.
Is the $1 trillion coin? It sounds like that would be just too late and maybe pie in the sky.
It's hard for me to think of a policy idea that's sillier than the $1 trillion coin, when measured against the severity of the situation that the policy is attempted to address. There's a law that allows the Treasury Department to mint platinum coins. And my understanding is that this law was passed because, gold coins are expensive or whatever. And the whole point of this is to allow the Treasury Department to make inexpensive commemorative coins. And I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think that the law did not specify a maximum denomination for those coins, and therefore it has been suggested by some that denomination could be, $30 trillion, or, I guess if it can be 30 trillion, why can't it be 300 trillion, or, whatever? Why is this problematic? First of all, it's obviously ridiculous on its face. Secondly, we have an entire system that is set up by laws about how our finances work. And the Treasury Department does not control the money supply in that system. The Fed does. And the Treasury Department is not empowered to just generate money, And so this would be, if we were to do this, it would reflect a substantial change in the way our government functions that is not reflected by congressional intent, that has never been understood to have been reflected by federal law, even if you could make some sort of technical legal argument. Third, for this to work, the Treasury Department would have to take that coin to the Fed and say, here, we have some money. Please credit our account and allow us to start writing checks. The Fed should not accept that coin. The Fed almost surely would not accept that coin, because that would be a gross change to the way our economic system operates. The Treasury Department might bring this to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would almost surely rule that the Treasury does not have the ability to create trillions of dollars out of thin air. And so it wouldn't survive a court challenge. Most importantly, I don't think it would solve the problem it might allow, let's say the Fed accepted the coin and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Treasury or whatever. It might allow Treasury to pay its bills. But what this is really about is what this debt ceiling situation is really about is the United States a country with functional enough politics that it can get its act together and pay the bills it is legally required to pay. And the question that is at the heart of this situation is American politics so dysfunctional that our government cannot get its act together and pay our bills? If the U.S. government has to resort to minting a $1 trillion platinum coin and walking that over to the Fed and saying, here you go, we've solved the problem, then global investors will be shaken to the core. That would still create conditions where there would be a giant vacuum in global financial leadership and a giant vacuum in America's role as a world leader more broadly. And that vacuum would get filled. It wouldn't get filled the next day. It wouldn't get filled the next month. It wouldn't get filled the next year, but that vacuum would get filled.